After my daughter told me I was too much for her engagement party, I quietly stopped covering her rent. 4 days later, I had 31 missed calls. My name is Harold Whitfield. I'm 58 years old, and for 3 years I paid the $3,600 monthly rent on the downtown loft where my daughter Vanessa and her fiancé Dominic lived, while I stayed in a rented room above a hardware store just to make it possible. That October evening, standing outside the private event hall where I wasn't allowed past the lobby, I finally understood what I was to them. I wasn't a father. I was a line item. Before I go further, tell me in the comments what state you're watching this from tonight, folks. And if you've ever had to draw a hard line with your own blood, hit that like button for me. I spent 32 years as a certified public accountant, the last 18 running audits for mid-sized manufacturing firms across 3 states. I know how to read a ledger the way most people read a face. I know exactly which numbers are lying to you before the footnotes even try to explain themselves. A family, I've come to learn, keeps its own set of books. There's what everyone says is happening, and there's what the transactions actually show. For 3 years, I had been quietly financing an illusion, and the columns had stopped balancing a long time before that night in October. My wife Diane passed 6 years ago from a stroke that took her in 11 minutes flat, no warning, no goodbye, just gone between one phone call and the next. After that, the house felt like a museum nobody visited. Vanessa was 26 then, engaged to a man named Dominic Reyes, a creative consultant whose actual income, as far as I could ever determine, hovered somewhere between unclear and non-existent. They were renting a cramped studio in a bad part of the city, and Vanessa called me crying about it twice a week. She wanted the loft downtown, the one with the exposed brick and the skyline view, the one every friend of hers was posting about. They didn't have the income to qualify. They didn't have the deposit. What they had was a very specific kind of confidence that assumes someone else will eventually solve the problem. I was the someone else. I told them I'd help bridge the gap while Dominic's consulting work picked up. I signed the lease under an LLC I'd formed years earlier for rental property purposes, told them it was a private landlord arrangement I'd negotiated, and set up an automatic transfer of $3,600 a month straight into the property management account. To afford it without touching my retirement accounts, I gave up my own condo, sold most of the furniture Diane and I had picked out together, and moved into a single, furnished room above Grady's Hardware on the east side of town. My mornings started with the sound of the roll-up gate going up at 7 sharp. My whole life fit into one closet and a dresser. I told myself it was temporary, a stress test, though if I'm honest, I think some part of me already suspected what the results would be. The calls from Vanessa became a kind of ritual. My phone would light up on a Thursday, and for half a second my heart would do this stupid, hopeful thing, thinking maybe she just wanted to talk. Instead it was always, "Dad, the HOA fee went up. Can you cover the difference? Dad, Dominic's card got declined at the caterer. We need 1,100 by Friday. Dad, we're doing engagement photos in Sedona. Can you help with flights?" Nobody asked about my knee, which had needed a replacement for 2 years that I kept putting off. Nobody asked if the room above the hardware store got cold in the winter. It did. I paid every invoice anyway. I told myself I was running an experiment, watching to see exactly how far entitlement could stretch before it finally tore. Dominic was worse than Vanessa in some ways, because at least she'd known me before all this. He looked at my flannel shirt and my 15-year-old truck like I was something the building super had forgotten to remove. When I visited, which was rare and always pre-approved like a dental appointment, he'd offer me a coaster before I'd even found a place to sit, like my hands themselves were a liability to the furniture. The break didn't come with shouting. It came quietly on a Saturday evening in October, cold enough that my breath fogged in front of the event hall doors. It was their engagement party. 200 guests, according to Vanessa, held in a restored ballroom downtown that I later learned cost $11,000 to rent for one night. I hadn't been invited to help plan it. I hadn't been asked for a dime toward it, which in hindsight should have told me something, since asking me for money was the one consistent habit in our relationship. I found out about it from a mutual cousin, and I decided foolishly that I would simply show up. I put on the one good suit I still owned, the navy one from Diane's funeral, had it pressed at the cleaners 2 doors down from my room, and drove the 40 minutes downtown with a card and a check tucked into my breast pocket. The lobby was warm, gold light pouring out from the ballroom doors, string music drifting out with it. I gave my name at a small table where a young woman in a headset was checking a list. She scanned it twice, looked up at me with an apologetic wince, and said my name wasn't on it. I told her there must be some mistake. I was the bride's father. She said she'd check. And a few minutes later, Vanessa came out into the lobby herself, in a champagne-colored dress I'd never seen, her face doing something complicated when she saw me standing there. "Dad," she said, keeping her voice low, glancing back toward the ballroom doors. "What are you doing here?" I told her I'd heard about the party and wanted to see her, wanted to give her something for the engagement. I held out the card. She didn't take it right away. "Dad, this is a curated guest list. Dominic's parents flew in. His business partners are here. It's very specific people. And she trailed off, her eyes flicking down to my suit, to my shoes, like she was doing some silent inventory. It's not that I don't want you here. It's just, tonight isn't really you'd stick out." Dominic appeared behind her a moment later, tuxedo jacket open, a glass of champagne in one hand, and I watched his face do the exact same calculation Vanessa's had. "Harold," he said, like my name itself was an inconvenience. "We talked about this being an intimate, curated thing. It's not personal." I looked at my daughter, the girl I'd taught to parallel park in an empty church lot, whose tuition I'd paid in full at a private university, whose rent check I'd never once been late on in 3 years, and I waited for something in her face to crack open. It didn't. "Just leave the card at the front table," Dominic said, already turning back toward the music. "We'll open everything tomorrow when it's just family. Just family." I stood in that lobby holding a check I'd written for $4,000, listening to 200 people I'd apparently helped fund from a distance, laughing on the other side of a door I wasn't allowed through. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. In accounting, when a set of books stops reconciling, you don't scream at the spreadsheet. You go back and you find the entry where the story and the numbers first diverged. I nodded once, said congratulations, and walked back out through the lobby into the cold. I sat in my truck in the parking garage for a long time without starting the engine, letting the silence do what shouting never could. Then I took out my phone, opened my banking app, and scrolled down to the recurring transfers. There it was, Property Management LLC, $3,600, scheduled for the first of the month. 3 years of that transfer executing without a single failure. It had paid for the view they photographed for their engagement announcement. It had paid for the marble countertops Vanessa complained weren't quite the right shade of white. It was the reason Dominic could call himself a consultant instead of unemployed. I looked at the cancel option, red text at the bottom of the screen. They didn't want me at the party. They needed the space to be exactly right for people who mattered. They'd built an entire life on the assumption that the money simply appeared, month after month, no maintenance required, and that I would always be standing quietly behind it, invisible and reliable as gravity. I pressed cancel. A confirmation box appeared. "Are you sure you want to end this recurring payment permanently?" Yes. The screen refreshed. The transfer was gone. I sat there for a moment, feeling something in my chest that wasn't quite relief and wasn't quite grief, something harder and cleaner than either. Then I started the truck and drove back to my room above the hardware store. My phone stayed silent that whole drive. It was 9:40 when I got home. By 9:52, it was ringing. Vanessa. I didn't answer. I let it ring itself out 4 times, watched the voicemail icon appear, and then I made a cup of tea and sat at my small kitchen table and let it ring some more. The next morning, I drove to my bank, First Merit, and asked for a full pull of every account under my name. Not because I expected to find anything, at first, but because the same instincts that make a good auditor uneasy were humming under my skin. I told the branch manager, a woman named Patricia I'd known for over a decade, that I wanted to verify the rent transfer cancellation had processed. It had. But I also asked her to run the activity on an old account I hadn't touched in years, the one I'd opened for Diane's final medical expenses, back when the hospice bills were coming in faster than I could track them by hand. I'd added Vanessa as a secondary signer at the time, a safety measure in case something happened to me while Diane was still sick. After the funeral, I'd left roughly $60,000 sitting untouched in that account, a strange, sad little monument to the worst year of my life. Patricia pulled a statement and slid it across the counter, her brow furrowing before she even finished speaking. The balance wasn't $60,000, it was just under $9,000. I asked for the full transaction history. The printer hummed a life. I read through 2 years of withdrawals with the same flat, clinical attention I'd give a client's books before a compliance audit. The pattern jumped out immediately, because patterns always do once you're looking for them. On the 14th of every month, exactly $1,900 had moved out of that account, not to a hospital, not to a pharmacy, to a joint account held by Vanessa and Dominic. I asked Patricia to trace where those funds ultimately landed. She had the clearance, since the accounts were linked, and her face went pale as the destinations populated on her screen. $600 a month to a private wine club membership. $900 a month to a luxury car lease for the SUV Dominic drove around like he'd earned it. The money set aside to ease my wife's final months had been quietly rerouted to finance the exact lifestyle they were flaunting at a party I wasn't allowed to attend. I didn't raise my voice in that bank lobby either. I asked Patricia what my legal options were, and she told me, gently, that because Vanessa was a legal signer, the bank considered those withdrawals authorized. Morally repugnant, she said, but not something the bank itself could prosecute. I told her to freeze every account tied to my name immediately, all future access requiring my physical presence and ID. She nodded and began the process. Then she paused, clicked into another tab, and looked at me with an expression I didn't like. She asked if I was aware of a recent credit line opened against that same account. I told her I hadn't opened any new credit in a decade. She turned the monitor toward me. 4 months earlier, an unsecured line of credit for $52,000 had been opened using that account as collateral, maxed out within 3 weeks. The funds wired directly to a boutique renovation firm that specialized in loft conversions. My signature was on the application. I leaned in close to the screen. I have spent 3 decades signing off on audited financial statements. My signature is precise, practiced, the same shape every single time. What was on that screen was a clumsy imitation, the loops too wide, the pressure inconsistent, the signature of someone trying to forge a habit they'd never actually studied. My son-in-law-to-be had forged my name to finance the renovation of the loft I was already paying for. I asked Patricia to print everything, stamp it with the bank seal, and I folded the documents into my coat without another word. I thanked her, declined her offer to loop in the fraud department just yet, and walked back out into the gray morning, knowing exactly where I needed to go next. I drove across town to see a man named Everett Solomon, a litigator I'd known since we were both broke 20-somethings, back when I did his taxes for free because he couldn't afford an accountant. And he returned the favor years later by handling my divorce paperwork from a marriage I'd had briefly before Diane at no charge. He owed me nothing anymore, technically, but he never let me pay him in full for anything since. When I walked into his office and set the folder on his desk, he read 3 pages before he even looked up. He asked what I wanted to do. I told him I wanted the truth to have consequences. Everett explained, and I already suspected as much, that the withdrawals alone were a civil gray zone, given Vanessa's legal access to the account. But the forged signature on the credit application changed everything. That was fraud. That was identity theft. That was a federal matter the moment the funds crossed state lines electronically, which they had. He told me to do nothing yet. Let the silence work. The rent had already bounced. The credit line would trigger its own alerts the moment they tried to draw on it again. Panic, he said, breeds mistakes, and mistakes are what convictions are built from. I went back to my room above the hardware store and I waited. By the next afternoon, the calls had reached 31. I know because I wrote each one down on a legal pad, time-stamped, the same way I'd log discrepancies in a client's books. The tones shifted with each one, irritation curdling slowly into panic. Dad, the property management company is saying our lease is in default. Call them and fix it. Dad, my car just got declined at the dry cleaner. This is humiliating. Dad, Dominic's furious. Please just call me back. The 31st voicemail was different. Vanessa's voice cracked halfway through. Dad, please. There's a notice taped to our door. It says we have 5 days to cure the default or vacate. I don't understand what's happening. Please call me back. I'm scared. I sat with that voicemail for a long time before I decided what to do with it. 2 nights later, they showed up at my door, the actual door of the room above Grady's hardware, which meant they'd had to ask around to even find where I lived since I'd never told them. Vanessa looked like she hadn't slept. Dominic looked furious in the particular way of a man who has never once had to solve his own problems and deeply resents being asked to start now. He didn't wait for me to open the door fully before pushing past me into the small room, tracking rain across the floorboards. He wanted to know why I'd frozen everything, why the rent had bounced, why there was a 5-day notice on his door like he was some deadbeat off the street. He said the wine club had already suspended his membership over one missed payment, that it was humiliating, that people were asking questions. I told him calmly that the account he'd been draining for 2 years was money set aside for his fiancé's mother's hospice care. I watched something flicker across his face, not quite guilt, more like the recalculating look of a man realizing a piece of the board had moved without his noticing. Vanessa started crying, saying it wasn't like that Dominic had told her the extra money was coming from a bonus, that she hadn't known, and maybe that was even true. I honestly don't know to this day how much she knew versus what she chose not to ask. But Dominic, cornered, stopped pretending. He said the money was rightfully going to be theirs eventually anyway, that I clearly didn't need it if I was living like this, gesturing at my one-room apartment with genuine disgust, that I had no right to punish them over a party invitation. I told him I hadn't frozen anything over a party. I told him about the forged signature. The silence that followed was the loudest thing in that room. Dominic's face went through several colors before he settled on rage, took a step toward me that closed the distance between us fast enough that I felt his breath, and told me I had exactly one option, which was to call the bank right now and reverse everything, or he would make sure Vanessa never spoke to me again for the rest of my life. I had, in fact, already anticipated something like this. Everett had insisted I install a small recording device in the room the day before, the kind that streams to a cloud server the moment it's triggered, tucked behind a stack of tax code binders on my shelf. I told Dominic quite plainly that everything he just said was being recorded, and that threatening an elderly man over stolen funds while standing in his home was not going to help his case. He lunged for the shelf. I stepped between him and it, and that was when he grabbed the front of my shirt, shouting something about how I owed him, how I'd promised to take care of Vanessa's future, how I was ruining everything over pride. I didn't fight him. I simply held the phone I already had in my hand and pressed the emergency call button. I'd set up with the local precinct's non-emergency line, already connected, already listening. 2 officers arrived within 11 minutes. By the time they reached the top of the stairs, Dominic had let go of my shirt, but the damage, so to speak, was already recorded, time-stamped, and backed up. Vanessa sobbed in the corner of the room while the officers took statements. Dominic tried the same story he'd try again later, that I was confused, that I was an old man having some kind of episode. But the recording didn't support that particular narrative, and neither did the forged bank documents I handed the responding officer, still folded neatly in my coat pocket. They left that night without an arrest, but with a report filed and a referral to the Financial Crimes Unit. The weeks that followed moved the way these things do once the machinery starts, slowly and then all at once. The property management company, alerted to the fraud investigation and the bounced rent, moved to terminate the lease within 30 days. Vanessa and Dominic packed up the loft under supervision, since their landlord's insurance required it once fraud was flagged on the account tied to their financials. I heard, secondhand, that Dominic tried to get an emergency line of credit from another bank to cover the move and was flatly denied once his name came up attached to an open fraud investigation. Then came the part I hadn't fully expected, though Everett warned me it was coming. 3 weeks after the eviction notice, Dominic's attorney filed an emergency petition claiming I was suffering from early cognitive decline, citing my erratic decision to cut off financial support and my confused, aggressive behavior the night of the confrontation as evidence. They wanted a court to appoint Dominic, of all people, as a temporary financial guardian over my remaining assets, pending evaluation. The petition included an affidavit from a physician I had never once met in my life, a doctor. Halloran, whose practice, it turned out, catered almost exclusively to a country club Dominic had recently started attending as someone's guest. I sat across from Everett as he explained this to me, and for the first time in the whole ordeal, I felt something close to real anger, cold and precise rather than hot. Everett, for his part, looked almost pleased. He told me this was the mistake we'd been waiting for. He sent me directly to the State University Hospital, where I spent 4 hours undergoing a full neuropsychological evaluation, the kind normally reserved for expert testimony in contested estate cases. I answered every question, solved every puzzle, recited every sequence, and at the end, the specialist told me my cognitive function tested in the top percentile for any age bracket, let alone mine. He signed a 20-page report and sealed it with the hospital's official letterhead. We walked into the emergency hearing 3 days later. Dominic's attorney stood up first and painted a portrait of a confused, paranoid widower who'd unraveled after being denied entry to a family event, citing the frozen accounts and the eviction as evidence of irrational decision-making. He presented Dr. Halloran's affidavit with theatrical solemnity. Everett stood, buttoned his jacket, and simply asked the court to note the date on the affidavit, signed exactly 9 hours after I'd served the fraud documentation to the bank. He then submitted my hospital evaluation, 20 pages of exhaustive, sealed, official proof of full cognitive competence, obtained by a doctor with no personal relationship to either party. The judge read both documents side by side in a silence that seemed to stretch the whole room thin. She looked up, first at Dominic's attorney, then at Dominic himself, and asked how his client had obtained a diagnosis of cognitive impairment from a physician who, by his own scheduling records, had never once examined the patient in question. The attorney had no real answer. The judge dismissed the petition with prejudice, referred the matter of the fraudulent affidavit to the state medical board, and noted for the record her serious concern about the timing and nature of the entire filing. It was in the parking lot after that hearing that Everett told me the detail he'd been quietly sitting on for over a week. The renovation contractor who'd received the forged credit line funds had, months earlier, been flagged in an entirely separate federal investigation into a small ring of document fraud operating out of 2 neighboring counties. When Dominic's name and forged signature surfaced in that broader investigation's evidence trail, it moved the case out of my hands entirely and into federal jurisdiction. The wire fraud alone, given the interstate transfer, carried mandatory sentencing guidelines that no local plea deal could soften. The arrest came on a gray Tuesday morning, 6 weeks after the party I hadn't been allowed to attend. I wasn't there to see it, but Everett told me later that federal agents arrived at the new apartment Vanessa and Dominic had scraped together. The imported SUV was seized in the parking lot in front of neighbors who'd been friendly enough with them a month earlier, and Dominic was taken into custody on charges of aggravated identity theft, wire fraud, and financial exploitation of an elder. Vanessa was not charged in the end, though she was named as a person of interest for several weeks while investigators determined how much she'd actually known. I believe to this day that she knew more than she's ever admitted, and less than the full picture, which is its own kind of tragedy, the tragedy of choosing not to look too closely at a life that's being paid for by someone else. The trial moved fast, the evidence too clean to contest. The recorded confrontation in my apartment, the forged signature analyzed by 2 separate handwriting experts, the paper trail from the medical account straight through to the wine club and the car lease. Dominic's own attorney withdrew 2 weeks before trial once the federal case folded in alongside the county's fraud ring investigation. He was sentenced to 9 years in federal custody. Restitution was ordered for every dollar traced back to that account, though everyone in that courtroom understood the money itself mattered less than the verdict finally saying, out loud, in a room with a judge's seal on the wall, that what had happened to me was real. I sold the LLC's remaining properties over the following spring, including a small rental unit I'd forgotten I even still owned from years earlier. I moved out of the room above Grady's Hardware, not into anything extravagant, just a modest 2-bedroom house on a quiet street with a maple tree in front that turns a genuinely spectacular red every October. I kept my old truck. I still do my own accounting by hand sometimes, just for the quiet of it. Vanessa reached out 4 months after the sentencing. Not to apologize, exactly, not at first, more to ask carefully how I was doing, testing the water the way you'd test ice you weren't sure would hold your weight. We've spoken a handful of times since. It isn't what it was before, and I've made peace with the fact that it may never be. I've told her clearly that I love her, that I always will, and that love was never actually the thing in question. What was in question was whether love obligates a person to keep funding their own disappearance, quietly, indefinitely, in exchange for nothing but the occasional invoice disguised as a phone call. I don't believe it does. I spent 3 years testing that theory in the most expensive way a father can test anything, and I have my answer now, filed away as certainly as any audited statement I ever signed my name to. If there's a lesson worth taking from any of this, it's this. Generosity is not the same thing as obligation, and a family that only calls when the money's due was never really calling for you at all. Protecting your own dignity, your own accounts, your own name isn't cruelty, it's just good bookkeeping. I'd love to hear from you, whoever's listening tonight, whether you're a father, a mother, a grandparent, Anyone who's ever had to draw a line with someone who shared their blood? Tell me in the comments if you've ever had to do the same thing I did and how it turned out for you.